Welcome to part 3 of the refresher of PMA's phase 3 study design. Here in part 3, we're going to be discussing the order of field operations, our 7 steps. Okay, so do you remember the order of field operations in 7 steps? Let's review that together. Here are the 7 steps from the start, where we find and confirm the dwelling unit, all the way up to step 7, where we're interviewing panel SDPs and administering the client exit interviews. Remember this cheat sheet that you had with you, the job aid. We're going to review that step by step. So the first step is to find and confirm the dwelling units from phase 2. You did this in phase 3. You did it very well. So you found the phase 2 dwelling units, then you confirmed that you are in the correct dwelling unit, and you found these dwelling units based primarily on the information provided to you from the previous phase listing form. And with the help of the Maps.me application, you then updated your progress on the list of phase 2 dwelling units on the interview tracking form. And then in step 2, you interview the household and eligible women, including any panel women you may find living in phase 2 dwelling units. So when you return to the dwelling unit during phase 3, you found one of many scenarios. So maybe the entire household from phase 2 was living there. Maybe some, but not all of the household members were still living there. Maybe a completely new household was living there, or maybe multiple new households were living there. Or maybe you found a destroyed or even uninhabited dwelling or dwelling unit converted into a business space or a store. So in that first scenario, if someone was living in the dwelling unit, so it is anything but destroyed or uninhabitable or converted into a business, you found someone living there, what did you do? Well, you screen the household first for COVID-19, and then you administer the household questionnaire, even if this household was not the same household that was living there during phase 2. If there were multiple new households, so if the phase 2 dwelling unit ended up containing multiple households, and one of them was the original household from phase 2, you only interviewed that original household. If instead the phase 2 dwelling unit contained multiple households when you passed there during phase 3, and there were any panel women in these multiple households, you interviewed each of the households where these panel women were living. Or if instead the phase 2 dwelling unit contained multiple households and none of them were that original phase 2 household, you then contacted your supervisor, who selected at random one of the households that you then interviewed. If any of the female members of the household were included on the list of phase 2 panel women, you ended up administering a female follow-up questionnaire, an FFQ, to those women. And if there were any women in the household whom you did not interview in phase 2 who were eligible to receive the female questionnaire, meaning they were between the ages of 15 or 49 and were included in the household roster, you then administered a female baseline questionnaire, an FBQ, to each of those new eligible women. This included women who were maybe 14 years old and listed in the household roster during phase 2, but then they now became eligible because they are now 15 years old and still listed in the household roster during phase 3. However, women who were 49 years old at the time of the last interview, you didn't give them the panel survey because they were now 50 during the current phase, and so they were ineligible for that female questionnaire. In general, households in the phase 2 dwelling units were included in the sample for the cross-sectional survey, meaning that the household counted towards the total number of households per EA that you completed for the cross-sectional survey. If in phase 3 you couldn't find a panel woman at the dwelling unit, you tried to determine her location and whether or not she was still located in the study area. You called her if you had her number from phase 2. You talked to current residents of the phase 2 dwelling unit. Maybe you even talked to neighbors who might have known where she went. And if she was still within the study area, you noted this in your phase 2 dwelling unit and interview tracking form. And then you attempted to locate her and interview her and her new household. You didn't do this quite yet in step 2, but you did this in step 6, which we'll get to. Okay, and remember that final part where maybe you returned in phase 3 and the entire dwelling unit was vacant. Well, a vacant dwelling unit means that it is still a dwelling unit, but no longer anyone living there. So it does not have anyone living there anymore. Remember, this was a change in phase 3 where in this case, we no longer marked this dwelling unit as lost to follow-up as we did in phase 2. Rather, we made sure to come back to this dwelling unit because someone might live there. So vacant dwelling units are a special case and they're not considered to be lost to follow-up. And you're not going to replace these vacant dwelling units at step 5. We're actually going to try to return there in the next phase because someone might live there in the future. But you still try to determine the location of any panel women who are located in that dwelling unit at phase 2. You talk to neighbors, you call their phones, and then as you completed these different interviews with households and women, you updated your progress on the list of phase 2 dwelling units and interview tracking form. Well, what if the dwelling unit was destroyed or not found or repurposed? Well, then the dwelling unit was considered lost to follow-up. If it was destroyed, maybe it was unable to be found. It's been repurposed into something that was no longer a dwelling unit, maybe a store, some other commercial space. For all of those scenarios, maybe you ended up replacing that dwelling unit in step 5. We'll see if we do that in step 5 when we get there, but at the very least, you try to determine the location of any panel women who were located in that dwelling unit. And you talk to neighbors, you call their phone numbers, you try to locate her so that we can talk to her at step 5. Now, what happened at step 3? Well, let's remember what you did in phase 3. You went and you tried to find those households and those women. You did what you could in steps 1 and 2. And then in step 3, you paused while data managers linked and cleaned your data. So you reported to your supervisor with your interview tracking form. They then worked with your data managers to determine the number of dwelling units in your AA that were lost to follow-up. That required some data cleaning by your data managers and for some EAs, this took a little bit more time than for others. They were able to proceed fairly quickly to that next step. Whatever you did, how long it took, you did not proceed with the remaining steps until you got approval from your supervisor. And then in step 4, you conducted mapping and listing. You followed the same standard process for conducting mapping and listing as you did for all of the other rounds of data collection with PMA. The one difference is that you completed this phase of the field work after you went to all of the phase 2 dwelling units in steps 2 and 3. Remember, in phase 2, we changed the order of field operations to facilitate the data cleaning and analysis, as well as to help make your work most efficient. And we have been using this order of operations since then. So you noted the dwelling units where you've already conducted interviews in steps 1 and 2. And then in step 5, you paused while your supervisor selected dwelling units to replace those that were lost to follow-up. Depending on the number of dwelling units lost to follow-up, maybe your supervisor selected new dwelling units to be included in the survey. Maybe they didn't. And then in step 6, you interviewed the household residing in newly selected dwelling units, the panel women living in the P2, the phase 2 panel dwelling units, and panel women who moved between phase 2 and phase 3. So let's look at the case of those newly selected dwelling units. Your supervisor selected them and they let you know about them. And then you went there to administer a household questionnaire to the households in each of these newly selected dwelling units, as well as a female baseline questionnaire, an FBQ, to all of the eligible women in these households per standard PMA procedures. And then that second part of step 6 involves panel women living in phase 2 dwelling units. You interview panel women who moved between phase 1 and phase 2, but still live where they did in phase 3, and now what we call a panel dwelling unit. You administer a household questionnaire and a female follow-up questionnaire to the panel women. And there's also the case of panel women who no longer live in phase 2 dwelling units. So if a panel woman no longer lives in a phase 2 dwelling unit, but is still living within the study area, you need to find her to continue her story. Once you find her, you will administer a household questionnaire to her new household and then administer a female follow-up questionnaire to her. The rule of thumb when relocating a panel woman is trying for a maximum of 6 total attempts, 3 in-person visits and 3 phone calls. And you do this 6 times before you actually determine her to be lost to follow-up. And now in step 7, you interviewed panel service delivery points, the SDPs, and you administered the client exit interviews based on your country. Remember that supervisors followed up with and interviewed the public SDPs that served the EAs, and you and your fellow RAs followed up with and interviewed the private SDPs that you had interviewed in previous phases. If there were any new private SDPs that you discovered during mapping and listing, you administered a baseline SDP survey to this facility or to those facilities. And if your EA had more than 3 private SDPs, as your supervisor selected the 3 that you should interview. Remember that the baseline and the follow-up SDP questionnaires are the same ODK forms, or the same ODK form. Okay, so let's just pause for one more second and review this design. Remember, we talked about cross-sectional surveys that give us a snapshot of a population at a given time. And we talked about panel surveys that are about telling women's stories over regular periods or intervals of time. And in phase 2 and in phase 3 of PMA, we did both at the same time. We also talked about a cross-sectional dwelling unit, which is a dwelling unit that we selected to have a frame. We selected it in phase 1, or we selected it as a replacement in phase 2 or phase 3. We also talked about panel dwelling units, and these are dwelling units that we visited because a panel woman moved there. So we were following her, trying to continue her story. We followed her there for the first time in phase 2 or in phase 3. In phase 3 of PMA, we continue to follow both the dwelling units in cross-sectional dwelling units and the panel woman in panel dwelling units. And why did we do this? So just as before, cross-sectional and panel surveys provide different kinds of information. Both are very important for policymakers to be able to make informed decisions about these populations. And lastly, there were 7 steps of the order of field operations, going from finding and confirming the cross-section dwelling unit from phase 2 in step 1, and then in step 2, interviewing the household and eligible women living in phase 2 cross-section dwelling units. Step 3, we paused while our data managers linked and created data and cleaned the data. In step 4, you moved on to conducting mapping and listing. In step 5, you paused while supervisors selected the dwelling units to replace any dwelling units that were lost to follow-up. And in step 6, you interviewed households residing in newly selected dwelling units and panel women who are no longer living in their phase 2 dwelling units and phase 2 panel dwelling units. And then finally, in step 7, you interviewed the panel service delivery points and you administered client exit interviews if your country decided to do so.